and welcome. I'm Ashwarya with you. The world today is growing increasingly restless. In the year 2019 and especially over the past few months, protests have been erupting across the globe. From Europe to Asia, Africa to the Middle East and South America, hundreds of thousands of people are calling for change. In Chile, Lebanon, Catalonia, Iraq and Pakistan, people are rising up to demand justice and social equality. In UK and Germany, they are spearheading a movement for cleaner climate that has spread to over 60 countries. In Lebanon, protesters are standing together to end alleged corruption. While on the streets of Chile, 1 million Chileans are protesting class inequality. The civil unrest around the world is impacting financial markets. It is raising questions about the quality and the direction of leadership in these countries. Our focus today are these trouble spots of the world today. What is driving up the protests in these countries? What will be its likely impact? Let's find out in depth today. Across the globe, even as public anger is spilling out on the streets of Hong Kong, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Ethiopia, Chile, United Kingdom and Pakistan, the question that is being asked is whether these are just unconnected instances or if there is any common thread that is binding these protests. Is technology driving them through a contagion effect? And if so, what will be the outcome? Let us find out in this report. Street protests and civil unrest are spreading alarmingly across the world. In recent weeks, they have taken the form of pitched battles between the police and demonstrators. Reports of deaths, arson, damage to public property have come from the Middle East, Asia, South America and the Caribbean. Reasons for the protests, of course, are many and varied, and each is specific to the people and their country. But all of them have an underlying theme of injustice and social inequality. But there are quite a few where the protesters are trying to break traditional shackles.
حسيت إنه أنا اليوم بدي أجي أمشي من هون مع هالعالم اللي واعي لفعلا أحقية قضية حقوق المرأة ببلدنا وبالعالم ولا يروح على رياض الصلح لأنه بعتقد هذا كله بصب بالمطالب العامة اللي عم نطالب فيها اللي هي مجرد إنه دولة عادلة فيها قانون مدني يحمي المواطن بغض النظر عن هويته الشخصية أو انتماءاته.
Many protests have reportedly sparked what is being called a contagion effect, prompting a social change movement across the world. Effects of these protests is shaking up global financial markets and economies. Investors are wary that the pressures that these civic unrests will exert on governments will impact their decisions adversely. Money managers and risk analysts seeking to explain the popular anger say that the unrest is particularly worrying, coming after years of modest global economic growth and relatively low joblessness. Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam has claimed she expects the Asian financial hub to record negative economic growth in 2019 due to the unrelenting violence. Experts say that while the boom and slump cycles are behind the protests in Latin America, global warming protests have been particularly strong in Germany and the United Kingdom. In Germany, the government recently launched a policy specifying that any spending pushing the government's budget into deficit must be on climate-focused investments. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV. And history is repeating itself in Pakistan as Prime Minister Imran Khan faces protests by an opposition party demanding his resignation. In Pakistan's hybrid military-civilian politics, Azadi March launched by Maulana Fazlur Rahman, leader of a faction of the Jamaat-e-Ulema Islami, whose main base is in Pashtun-dominated Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province.
In 2014, Imran Khan, as an opposition leader, had led a similar Azadi march seeking the ouster of the then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. The march had built public opinion in Khan's favor. And now, in a repeat of history, Fazlur Rahman is drawing thousands of people on the streets for his Azadi march. The anti-government procession largely focuses on issues related to Kashmir as well as anger towards Prime Minister Imran Khan. Now, protesters say that Khan's government is illegitimate and that he came to power through the support of the army. Imran Khan also faces accusations of fraud during his successful election campaign in 2018. The demonstration has been backed by opposition parties like the Pakistan Muslim League of former Premier Nawaz Sharif and the Pakistan People's Party of former President Asif Zardari. Nationalist and secular parties have also backed the protests. The Azadi March began in October 27 in Karachi and then it passed through Sindh and Punjab.
हम जिस अमन के साथ आए हैं, हमारे इस अमन का एहतराम किया जाए, कौम के अमन का एहतराम किया जाए, सियासी जमातों के अमन का एहतराम किया जाए। हम मज़ीद सब्र व तहम्मुल का मुज़ाहरा नहीं करेंगे।
उन्होंने ये कहा था कि हमने इस्तीफे के बगैर नहीं जाना। ठीक, हमने ये बरमला कह दिया कि प्राइम मिनिस्टर का इस्तीफा इज़ आउट ऑफ क्वेश्चन। मैं आज भी कह रहा हूँ आपके सामने, प्राइम मिनिस्टर का इस्तीफा इज आउट ऑफ क्वेश्चन.
And in depth, we'll take a very short break, and up next we'll talk about civil unrest in some other parts of the globe as well. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back after the break. You're watching In Depth, and today we are talking about civil unrest in various parts of the globe. The global trends challenging governance and changing nature of power are driving major consequences. And within countries, tensions are rising because citizens are raising basic questions about what they can expect from their governments in a constantly changing world. And in this report, let's take a look at the political unrest in Ethiopia, Chile, Ecuador, and Bolivia.
In Ethiopia, weeks after receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed came under harsh criticism over his silence in the face of protests that resulted in the deaths of 78 people. Thousands of people took to the streets of the capital Addis Ababa and many regional towns last week. These protests were spurred by a prominent critic of the Prime Minister who had accused the police of plotting an attack on him. The critic, Jawar Mohammed, is the founder of an independent media network. He claimed that there was a plan to arrest or possibly kill him at his house in Addis Ababa. The acquisition stoked long-standing tensions in Ethiopia and drove hundreds of Jawar's ethnic Oromo supporters to gather outside his home.
Prime Minister in the Parliament publicly and openly and harshly threatened the media and myself, which was unusual and unexpected.
In Chile, as many as 1 million protesters flooded Santiago City this week. The protests turned violent as police clashed with protesters. Protests started in mid-October, triggered by a hike in public transport fares, but later boiled into riots, arson and looting, which has killed at least 18 people and injured hundreds. Demonstrators have demanded political and economic social reforms, addressing what they describe as inequality, deficient public services and government repression. President Sebastián Pinera has promised to boost the minimum wage and pensions, ditch fare hikes on public transport, overturn a recent increase in electricity prices, and fix the country's ailing healthcare system.
Desde la calle cambios estructurales. Queremos una nueva constitución a través de una asamblea constituyente y no queremos que el Estado tenga que subsidiar a los empresarios que son los ofrecimientos que ha hecho este gobierno. Por eso estamos en la calle, por dignidad, por trabajo, por salud, por vivienda, porque tenemos derechos que no están siendo respetados en este país. ¡No más muertes! ¡No más muertes!
Meanwhile, mass anti-government protests paralyzed Ecuadorian transportation and other services. Protesters were angry over President Lenin Moreno's decision to cut decades-old fuel subsidies and implement tax and labor reforms. The protests at times turned violent, with police using tear gas, pepper spray and sound bombs on demonstrators, some of whom responded by throwing rocks and Molotov bombs. President Moreno has now struck a deal to cancel a disputed austerity package and end nearly 2 weeks of protests that have paralyzed the economy and left 7 dead. Over in Bolivia, the government has accused its rivals of plotting deadly violence against it, after an opposition figure vowed to overthrow leftist President Evo Morales and called for the military's support. Deadly unrest has gripped the South American country since Morales was named winner on the October 20th election, giving him a 4th term. His opponents have branded the result of fraud, and Carlos Mesa, who ran against Morales in the recent polls, has called for a new vote to be held.
Que algunos grupos no reconocen el triunfo del pueblo boliviano. No son las mayorías, pequeños grupos. Algunos piden sus paros hasta que se vaya Evo. Unos dicen nuevas elecciones. Otros dicen.
The common thread throughout the protest has been the theme of injustice and social inequality, which in turn has triggered global calls for action. Major protests have reportedly sparked a contagion effect, prompting a social change movement across the world. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
Waves of sustained protests have shaken entrenched Arab rulers, with hundreds of thousands of people from Lebanon, Iraq and Egypt calling for change. United in their calls to end corruption and unemployment, demonstrators in these Arab countries are fueling a new era of unrest that has defied violent crackdowns and politicians' appeals to stay home.
The Arab world is witnessing a new wave of demonstrations, with citizens in Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt and other countries in the region taking to the streets. Some protesting economic woes, some corruption and other potentially destabilizing factors. In Iraq, there has been a crackdown on demonstrators. In Lebanon, protesters have paralyzed the country, and in Egypt, security forces crushed attempts to protest against the police state of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Though these countries have plenty of differences, but the common thread throughout the protests has been a theme of injustice and social inequality. In Lebanon, protesters have recently stood together to end alleged government corruption, accusing the government of pushing the economy to the point of collapse. These protesters have come from diverse communities, religions, sects and political groups. Though the country's unprecedented wave of demonstrations had been a long time coming, the government's WhatsApp tax has become the final straw. Others say the government's inaction over wildfires that tore through Lebanon this month have also been cited as the cause of protests. The nationwide protests, which were ignited on October 17th by a government proposal to tax WhatsApp calls, also led Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri to resign on October 29th. Hariri said he had hit a dead end in trying to resolve the crisis, but the resignation too has failed to quell the nationwide protests. Over in Iraq, many small uprisings have developed into generalized civil unrest. The demonstrations in Iraq this month have been mostly led by young people, those who are fed up with the high rate of unemployment. The protests have rocked Baghdad and Iraq's southern provinces, with protesters demanding reforms to fight corruption and unemployment. There are also calls for a total overhaul of the country's political system. The protests have led to the death of nearly 250 people. With the background of foreign occupation, civil war and an insurgency led by Islamic terror groups since 2003, critics say one of the biggest challenges is to calm the conflict in Iraq before security in the region spirals out of control. Egypt's 2011 ousting of its longtime leader was initially hailed as a momentous new era in the history of a country. But less than 2.5 years later, after the fall of Hosni Mubarak, his successor, Muslim Brotherhood member Mohammad Morsi, was also deposed in a military coup amid more mass protests. Since his 2013 election, former military commander Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has consolidated his authority and again bestowed wide-ranging powers upon the country's armed forces. Amid Egypt's socio-economic troubles and struggles against Islamic State militants, al-Sisi has struggled to deliver on promised reforms. Meanwhile, this time the call for the protest originated from a now exiled businessman who posted a series of videos alleging corruption and waste involving top government figures. In Egypt, the government has responded with a wave of arrests accompanied by mysterious social media censorship. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.
And Hong Kong has been in the news this year for continued civil unrest. The protest started in June against proposals to allow extradition to mainland China, but demonstrations developed to include demands for democracy and also an inquiry into police actions. And France also witnessed its Yellow Vest movement that started last year, not down and born on social media and Facebook in particular. The Yellow Vest movement, that was initially a backlash against a proposed fuel tax hike, remains unprecedented on many metrics. And 2019 year also saw a global environmental movement gaining strength. So take a look at the civil unrest in these nations in UK, in France and in Hong Kong. As I take your leave, I'll see you tomorrow in another edition of In Depth. Thanks for watching.
After the umbrella movement in 2014, Hong Kong has been on the boil again. In June, protests started over a proposed extradition bill that would have allowed criminal suspects to be extradited to mainland China and tried in courts controlled by the Communist Party. The bill sparked fears that Hong Kong's freedoms were being eroded. As protests continued, city leader Carrie Lam agreed to suspend the extradition bill, but demonstrations continued to include demands for full democracy and an inquiry into police actions. The bill was withdrawn in September, but protesters said this was too little, too late. Clashes between police and activists have become increasingly violent. On 1st of October, while China was celebrating 70 years of Communist Party rule, Hong Kong experienced one of its most violent and chaotic days. The wave of protests continued this past weekend. Hong Kong protesters used Halloween to protest mask ban. Despite reports of Beijing planning to replace Lam, China's President Xi Jinping told her in a meeting in Shanghai that the central government has a high degree of confidence in her. Protesters vow to continue with the demonstrations.
Police force now consists of mindless sadists, rapists, criminals, and every second this city has to put up with them is 1 second too many. Now that Hong Kong is a police state, the police trumps all other disciplinary forces.
France has been racked with civil unrest since last November, with yellow-vested protesters taking to the streets in towns and cities. The original catalyst for protests was a planned increase in hydrocarbon tax introduced as part of the French government's environmental strategy that would push up fuel prices, especially diesel, from 1st of January. The protests, however, morphed into wider anti-establishment action. Demonstrations often turned violent, leading to dramatic clashes with French riot police. Last week, 600 Yellow Vest protest organizers from across France gathered for a national assembly to debate the future of their movement. French President Emmanuel Macron was caught out by the Yellow Vest protests when they started last year, as protesters accused him of ignoring the day-to-day struggles of ordinary French people. The numbers have dropped far below the initial protest in November last year. which brought out more than 280,000 people across France.
Que les choses ne sont pas réglées et qu'elles vont prendre du temps. Elles vont prendre du temps parce que ni la région, ni le département, ni les maires, ni le gouvernement ne peuvent régler du jour au lendemain le cœur des problèmes qui se sont ainsi construits. Il est vrai que pendant des décennies, on a répondu à la colère par de l'argent public. Les prix sont trop élevés, l'État va vous faire un chèque. Il manque des emplois, on va faire des emplois aidés, les collectivités vont embaucher. Ça n'est pas durable, on a menti aux gens. C'est pour ça qu'on arrive à la fin de ce système.
The UK, that is anyway grappling with Brexit crisis, is also witnessing a climate unrest in form of Extinction Rebellion protests. Extinction Rebellion wants governments to declare a climate and ecological emergency and take immediate action to address climate change. Extinction Rebellion was launched in 2018 and organizers say it has now groups willing to take action in dozens of countries. The group uses an hourglass inside a circle as its logo to represent time running out for many species. It describes itself as an international non-violent civil disobedience activist movement. In April this year, Extinction Rebellion held a large demonstration in London. Over the course of 11 days, some of the city's busiest routes were brought to a standstill. Protests first began in April 2018 in London. 2025 is the year when the group aims for zero carbon emissions. It has 298,000 followers on Facebook. Close to 1,130 people were arrested over April's London protests.
We're here to declare a climate emergency to raise the alarm because the whole world is on a train heading over a cliff. If we don't pull the alarm and stop the train, we're all going to head over the cliff together at some point in the not very distant future.
Clearly, if it was the demand for more political freedoms in Hong Kong, the call was for better economic policies in France. 2019 saw many countries on the edge. In the UK, Extinction Rebellion protesters say the future of the planet depends on it. Bureau Report, Rajya Sabha TV.